The night sea was black. Only the hum of engines cut through the wind. 3 Packard V-12s, roaring like caged thunder beneath a hull no thicker than a man's arm. Salt spray stung the faces of young sailors who could not yet grow full beards. They gripped the rails, eyes fixed on the horizon, where enemy searchlights swept the darkness, one by one, like cold fingers reaching for their souls. Somewhere out there, in the heart of the Pacific, a new kind of warship was being tested. Light, fast, fragile, and made, unbelievably, of aluminum. Every rule said it would fail. Every manual warned it would melt, buckle, or burn. But this was not an ordinary war. In 1942, when the United States Navy faced the vastness of the Pacific, it needed something that didn't yet exist: a vessel small enough to slip through reefs, fast enough to strike and vanish, yet deadly enough to wound an empire. Battleships were too slow, destroyers too large, submarines too few. What the Navy needed was speed and audacity. So, in secret workshops and noisy shipyards, a handful of engineers, young, stubborn, and sleepless, began to shape the impossible. They were told aluminum was for airplanes, not for the sea. "It'll corrode. It'll crumble," one admiral warned. "A saltwater kiss will eat your boat alive." But the engineers didn't listen. They couldn't. Because somewhere between ambition and desperation, America had run out of time to doubt. The first prototype looked like something built from a child's toy box. All edges, no armor. Just a skeleton of metal wrapped in plywood and hope. A sailor once joked, "You could punch a hole through her hull if you were angry enough." He wasn't entirely wrong. Yet when those engines came alive, the deck trembling beneath the weight of power, even skeptics turned their heads. The boat didn't just move. It flew. It leapt across the surface of the sea, leaving behind a trail of white foam and disbelief. From the shore, old shipwrights stared in silence. The impossible had floated. In time, these vessels would earn a name whispered with both pride and fear: patrol torpedo boats, small, swift, disposable. The men who sailed them called them the Mosquito Fleet because they stung hard, fast, and vanished before the enemy could swat back. But behind every sleek line and roaring engine was a secret battle fought not on the open ocean, but in blueprints, foundries, and sleepless nights under the glow of industrial lamps. A battle of minds against metal, of conviction against convention, of engineers who believed that if aluminum could fly, it could also float. They weren't heroes in the trenches or cockpits. They didn't wear medals or hear the scream of shells. But their war, the silent one, was just as perilous. Because every miscalculation, every rivet, every weld meant the difference between a crew returning home or vanishing beneath the waves, and yet somehow they made it work. Their boats would patrol the coasts of Guadalcanal, race through the night at 40 knots, unleash torpedoes, and disappear into fog before the enemy could react. One of them, a small vessel marked PT-109, would carry a young lieutenant named John Fitzgerald Kennedy. But long before his name became legend, it was just another aluminum and plywood craft, shuddering against the Pacific wind. No one believed such boats could survive open war, but in those dark waters, when steel giants sank and fire filled the sky, it was these fragile vessels that refused to die. The story of the PT boats is not only about design or daring, it's about defiance, the kind born when a nation decides that the impossible is just another engineering problem. And at the heart of it all were the people who built them. Men with grease on their hands and sleepless eyes, whose work was often forgotten beneath the noise of victory parades. This is their story, of how they challenged the sea and made it carry aluminum on its back. Before the roar of engines, there was only silence and fear. The year was 1941. The Pacific stretched like an endless, indifferent mirror, but beneath that calm surface, the world was about to change forever. When Japanese bombers struck Pearl Harbor on December 7th, the United States Navy, proud, powerful, and unprepared, found itself bleeding in its own waters. Battleships burned in the harbor like floating tombs. Smoke rose over Honolulu, dark as mourning cloth. In a single morning, the illusion of invincibility sank with the USS Arizona. The Navy had been built for another war, one of dreadnoughts, long lines, and slow, thunderous exchanges. But this new war was a different creature, fast, elusive, and fought across millions of miles of ocean, where there were no front lines, no clear borders, no rest. It demanded ships that could think like guerrillas. The ocean was no longer a stage for grand fleets. It was a hunting ground, and hunters needed speed. In Washington, meetings dragged into the night. Admirals argued, engineers proposed, skeptics scoffed. Could a small, fast boat, barely 80 feet long, really challenge the rising tide of the Imperial Navy? At first, the idea sounded almost childish. Big ships ruled the seas, always had, always would. But war is not kind to tradition. By the time Japanese forces spread like wildfire through the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, it became clear America couldn't fight this war with battleships alone. They needed something that could strike quickly, deliver a blow, and vanish before the enemy's guns could turn. That was when a quiet transformation began, not in the fleet's admirals' halls, but in the hands of civilian boat builders. Across America, in small yards along the eastern seaboard from Massachusetts to Florida, craftsmen who once built yachts and pleasure cruisers were called into service. Among them was the Electric Boat Company of Connecticut, and a smaller, lesser-known outfit in Bayonne, New Jersey, Elco. These were not military giants. They were designers, tinkerers, dreamers. Men who spoke the language of hull curvature and propeller pitch, not strategy or politics. They began to draw, to imagine vessels that could run faster than destroyers, turn tighter than submarines, and carry the sting of torpedoes on a frame lighter than any warship before it. Still, one problem stood in their way: weight. To reach the speeds they needed, 40, even 45 knots, the boats had to be light, but steel was too heavy, wood too weak. And so, one voice suggested the unthinkable: aluminum. The room went silent. Aluminum? For a ship? That was madness. To most engineers of the time, aluminum belonged to the sky. It was the metal of aircraft, light, yes, but treacherous against salt and water. It corroded, it cracked, it failed under pressure. Naval tradition was made of iron and steel, not shimmering metal that could be dented by a wrench. Yet war had no patience for tradition. Elco's engineers began experimenting, layering aluminum with mahogany, sealing joints with resin, bolting thin plates where steel had once been. They built skeletons that looked fragile, almost comical. But when they tested them, the results were undeniable. These boats didn't just move fast. They danced. Word spread quickly through the docks. The Navy's Bureau of Ships was skeptical, but desperation breeds innovation. Contracts were signed. Production began. In a matter of months, workshops once filled with luxury hulls became wartime factories. Men and women, some who had never seen the ocean, hammered, welded, and riveted through sleepless nights. Each hull number was more than a serial code. It was a promise. That speed, not armor, would be the new defense. They called them PT boats, patrol torpedo boats, 80 feet long, 3 engines, 4 torpedoes, a few machine guns, enough fuel to chase death across the Pacific. They were not built to survive hits. They were built to never be hit. By 1942, the first squadrons of PT boats were deployed to the Solomon Islands, the Philippines, and New Guinea. Their crews were young, most in their early 20s. Some had never seen combat before. Others were restless souls who couldn't bear to wait for glory on a battleship. They lived in cramped bunks, ate canned rations, and fought the sea more often than the enemy. But when the engines roared to life, and the boat leapt forward across the waves, they felt it. The strange exhilaration of speed meeting danger. A PT boat wasn't just a machine. It was a challenge thrown in the face of the Pacific itself. On paper, they were just numbers. PT-34, PT-41, PT-109. But to those who manned them, they were alive companions, protectors, and sometimes executioners. In the next chapter of the war, these fragile, improbable vessels would find themselves face to face with steel monsters, Japanese destroyers, cruisers, and aircraft that could crush them in seconds. And yet they sailed into the darkness anyway, because someone had to, because speed and faith were all they had left. He was not a soldier. He had never held a rifle, never seen the face of an enemy through a gun sight. But when the war began, Andrew Higgins waged his own quiet battle not with bullets, but with blueprints. In 1940, Higgins was just a boat builder from Louisiana. Loud, stubborn, and brilliant in his own unpolished way, his workers called him the boss with the bark. The Navy called him a nuisance. He built shallow draft workboats for loggers in the swamps of the Mississippi Delta, ugly, boxy things that could scrape through mud and still float. The kind of boats no admiral would ever glance at twice. But Higgins had one thing that the Navy didn't: imagination. When he heard that the military needed a vessel that could move fast and land men on beaches, he didn't wait for approval. He started building one himself. He didn't have steel. So he used what he knew: plywood, marine glue, and aluminum reinforcements. And when the Navy finally came to see his creation, they laughed. "It's a toy," one officer said. Higgins only smiled. "Let's take it for a ride." In minutes, the boat was flying down the river, cutting the brown water like a razor. It could turn within its own length, skim over shallows, and stop on a dime. The officers who mocked him were silent now, their caps clutched against the wind. By the time they reached shore, one of them whispered, "This thing could change the war." That ugly little boat, born in the bayous, despised by bureaucracy, became the foundation for two of America's most important wartime vessels: the landing craft, vehicle, personnel, LCVP, and the PT boat. But where Higgins was the maverick who broke open tradition, another man would refine the idea, turning it into a weapon of pure speed. That man was Henry R. Sutphin, chief designer at Elco, a reserved, bespectacled engineer who believed that perfection was found not in theory, but in the sound of an engine running right. Sutphin was a quiet contrast to Higgins' fury. Where Higgins shouted, Sutphin calculated. Where Higgins demanded, Sutphin adjusted, measured, tested. He'd grown up on the docks of Bayonne, New Jersey, the smell of tar and salt in his lungs since childhood. He'd watched the world's great ships glide past, each one slower than the tide. Now, with war pressing in, he wanted to build something that could outrun death itself. Under Sutphin's lead, Elco's team, a handful of engineers and craftsmen working around the clock, transformed the Navy's vague specifications into something real. An 80-foot torpedo boat with a frame of wood, a skeleton of aluminum, and 3 roaring Packard engines that could propel it faster than any ship of its size in history. When they first tested it in New York Harbor, witnesses said the water split like silk. The engines screamed so loud that the sound echoed against the warehouses. Even the seagulls scattered. Still, not everyone believed. Old Navy veterans called it a death trap. "A single bullet," they said, "and that thing will burn like a matchbox." Sutphin didn't argue. He knew they were right, but he also knew that survival in this new war wasn't about armor. It was about movement. He often said quietly, "If we can't outgun them, we'll outfly them on water." His obsession consumed him. He spent nights on the factory floor, eating from tin trays, scribbling new propeller angles and hull shapes on scraps of paper. Once a worker found him asleep against a bulkhead, hand still holding a pencil. When they woke him, he simply said, "Did it run?" That was how the war was fought for men like Sutphin, not with rifles or flags, but with rulers, rivets, and sleeplessness. In 1942, the first combat-ready PT boats were shipped out to the Pacific. Sutphin watched as they left the dock, his aluminum dreams carried by boys who could barely grow mustaches. He would never see what happened next, but those who sailed them would carry his name in silence. One of those boys was Ensign Byron White, a college football star turned naval officer. Later, he would become a Supreme Court justice. But in those days, he was just another young man learning how to coax a machine built for miracles. He wrote in his diary, "The engines shake the bones of this ship. At full speed, you can't hear your own thoughts. But in that roar, there's a kind of freedom, the kind that only men who have nothing between them and the sea will ever understand." The boats were fast, unbelievably fast but fragile. They could not withstand shell fire, nor could they afford mistakes. Every mission was a gamble. Every wave could hide a mine. Every night could be their last. And still, they went. Because every PT crew knew what they carried wasn't just fuel and torpedoes. It was the faith of engineers who dared to prove the impossible. In the next months, their test would come in the dark, contested waters of the Solomon Islands. There, under moonlight and tracer fire, aluminum and plywood would meet steel and iron, and no one knew which would survive. The Pacific at night was a place of ghosts. The sea breathed in the dark, black waves rising and falling like the slow heartbeat of something ancient. Above it, the stars burned cold and bright, as if they were watching men die from a distance. It was here, in these endless, ink-colored waters, that the PT boats made their debut. They were small against the immensity of the Pacific, toy ships in a sea of giants. Yet when their engines roared to life, the night itself seemed to move. Each PT boat carried 3 Packard V12 engines, a total of 4,500 horsepower packed into a hull that barely weighed 50 tons. At full throttle, they could reach 45 knots, nearly 52 miles per hour across open water. But speed was only half their weapon. The other half was silence. Because when those engines cut, when the throttle was eased, and only the whisper of waves against the hull remained, the PT boats could glide invisible, deadly, and close enough to strike before the enemy even knew they were there. The Solomon Islands burned with war. Every day, the sea carried fresh debris, lifeboats, oil drums, the floating dead. And in that chaos, the PT boats arrived small, brash, and untested. They were stationed at Tulagi and Rendova, a cluster of jungle-covered bases where mosquitoes bit as fiercely as bullets. Crews slept in hammocks strung between palm trunks, their uniforms soaked with sweat, their rifles rusted from salt air. The men were barely out of college, many just 21 or 22. They called themselves the Mosquito Fleet, and they wore the name like a badge of honor. Every night they went hunting. Their mission was simple and suicidal: slip into enemy waters under cover of darkness, lie in wait for Japanese convoys, troop transports, and supply barges, and strike with torpedoes before vanishing back into the blackness. It was a game of nerves, and no one knew who would see whom first. Radar was primitive, unreliable. Most navigation was done by instinct, by memory, and by starlight. The PT boats moved in pairs or trios, black shapes cutting silently through the surf. The smell of oil and sea mixed with the faint sweetness of gasoline fumes. The only light came from the glow of a cigarette, the red tip quickly hidden behind a cupped hand. And then, out there in the distance, a faint shadow, a darker shape against the night. Contact, someone would whisper. Engines throttled down. Hearts began to race. They'd drift closer. One man on the bow would peer through binoculars, counting seconds between waves, trying to make out the silhouette. Was it a destroyer? A cruiser? A barge? Sometimes they guessed wrong, and in the Pacific, a wrong guess was death. The first real test came in the Battle of Guadalcanal, when PT boats were sent against Japanese supply convoys bringing reinforcements to the island. The enemy called their resupply runs the Tokyo Express. Fast destroyers ran at night, unloading men and munitions before American aircraft could find them at dawn. The PT boats were sent to intercept, fragile aluminum and wood against steel leviathans. When the first engagement came, the sea was flat and silent. The moonlight turned the surface silver. At 1:40 a.m., radar picked up movement. 4, maybe 5 destroyers moving fast. The PTs went to full throttle, bouncing across the waves like skipping stones. Spray blinded the gunners. Torpedo men held tight to their launch tubes, waiting for the order. Fire 1! Fire 2! The torpedoes streaked out, leaving thin white trails behind them. Seconds later, nothing. They missed. The destroyers turned, searchlights snapping to life. Blinding cones of white light sliced through the dark, locking onto the small, leaping boats. And then hell itself opened. 5-inch shells tore into the water, sending columns of foam 30 feet high. The ocean exploded around them. One PT boat caught fire, the aluminum frames glowing red, the wooden deck erupting in flames. But the others turned hard, engines screaming. throwing the boat sideways across the waves. The gunners opened up, twin 50-caliber Brownings hammering against the glare of the searchlights. Tracer rounds carved orange arcs through the night. The smell of cordite filled the air. "Get us out!" someone shouted. The helmsman didn't answer. He was too busy keeping the boat from rolling as shells slammed into the water within feet of the hull. When they finally broke free of the searchlights, when the sea swallowed them back into shadow, there was silence. Only the sound of the engines, only the hiss of waves against the hull. They'd failed to sink the destroyers, but they'd survived, and that, in the Pacific, was victory enough. Over the next months, the PT crews learned painfully how to fight. They learned that torpedoes often ran too deep, missing targets entirely. That salt spray corroded ignition switches, that the aluminum supports near the exhaust would warp under continuous heat. Every mission became an experiment, every return to base a lesson written in blood and oil. They modified their craft bolting extra machine guns to the bow, adding homemade armor from scrap steel. Some even lashed spare fuel drums to the deck for range, knowing one stray bullet could turn the whole ship into a fireball, and still, they went out. Because every night they delayed the Tokyo Express, every transport they forced to turn back, bought one more day for the Marines on Guadalcanal. It wasn't glory they chased, it was duty. As one lieutenant wrote home, "When you're out there, you don't think about medals or headlines. You just think about the next wave and whether it's going to kill you or not." By 1943, the PT boats had earned respect. Even Japanese sailors began to fear their sudden appearances in the dark. They called them devil boats. But for the men who crewed them, there was no fear, only exhaustion, salt, and the knowledge that every night might be their last. And soon, that truth would become painfully real for one young lieutenant and his small craft, PT-109. Because one moonless night in August 1943, the impossible happened. The boat that shouldn't have floated would meet something it could not outrun. The night of August 1st, 1943 was darker than ink. Even the stars seemed to have fled. In the Solomon Islands, between Kolombangara and New Georgia, the men of PT-109 drifted in the black silence of the Pacific. Their engines idled low, the smell of gasoline and oil heavy in the humid air. At the helm stood Lieutenant, junior grade, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, 26 years old. Tall, wiry, with eyes that reflected both intelligence and a fatigue beyond his years. He was not yet the man the world would one day know. Here, he was simply skipper. His crew, 12 men, trusted him not because of rank, but because of how he stood in the face of fear. He didn't shout, he didn't boast, he listened. And when the engines coughed or the sea turned against them, he was the first to crawl below deck, sleeves rolled up, hands black with oil, fixing the problem himself. They'd been at sea for hours, part of a patrol meant to intercept Japanese destroyers on a resupply run the Tokyo Express again. But this night was different. No moon, no horizon, only the sound of the waves slapping softly against the hull. The men were exhausted. The radio hissed static. Kennedy scanned the dark, squinting through binoculars. Nothing. Only the smell of fuel, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of fear. Then, without warning, the night erupted. At 2:30 a.m., out of the blackness, a shadow appeared, massive, silent, and fast. The Japanese destroyer Amajiri, 2,000 tons of steel and fury, emerged from the dark at full speed. There was no time to react. "Ship on the starboard bow." Kennedy spun the wheel, shouting for full throttle, but it was too late. A flash of gray, a roar like thunder, and then impact. The Amajiri's bow sliced through PT-109 like a knife through paper. The boat split in two. Flames erupted, painting the ocean with fire. Men were thrown into the water, some screaming, some silent. For a moment, Kennedy was underwater disoriented, lungs burning. When he surfaced, all he saw was chaos. One half of his boat burned furiously. The other half was gone. He called out into the darkness. One by one, voices answered, wounded, panicked, alive. "McMahon, Tom, Bartholomew." 7 men, Then 9. Then 10. 2 missing. He dove again into the dark, searching. In the black water, the smell of burning fuel clung to his skin. He found one badly burned unconscious. Kennedy wrapped an arm around him and began to swim. His other arm pulled him forward, inch by inch, through the debris and oil. It took 3 hours to bring the survivors together, clinging to the wreckage as the fire from their ship died into embers on the waves. The sea was quiet again. Too quiet. They were alone adrift, in enemy waters. When dawn came, the sun revealed what the night had hidden. The Pacific stretched out forever. No ships, no rescue. Only the distant green outline of an island miles away. Kennedy knew what that meant. If they stayed, they'd drift out to sea. If they swam, they might drown. But there was no choice. He tore a strap from his life belt, tied it to the collar of the burned man, Seaman Patrick McMahon, and bit down on it. Then, without a word, he began to swim. For 5 hours, Kennedy dragged the injured man through the water, kicking against waves, salt burning his eyes. Behind him, the crew followed, clinging to planks, paddling silently. They reached a small coral islet, Plum Pudding Island, uninhabited, desolate. They collapsed onto the sand, too exhausted to speak. There was no food, no fresh water, only the wreckage that drifted to shore and the sound of the surf. That night, Kennedy slipped back into the water alone, trying to flag down passing boats. He failed. He tried again the next night, and the night after that. For 6 days, the men of PT-109 waited hungry, sunburned, bitten by insects, growing weaker by the hour. But Kennedy refused to rest. He swam miles through the dark to another island, found coconuts, and carried them back, one at a time. On the 6th night, he encountered 2 Islander scouts loyal to the Allies. He carved a message into a coconut shell. Naro Islay. Commander, native knows position. He can pilot. 11 alive need small boat. Kennedy. That coconut would later sit on his desk in the Oval Office, the only reminder he ever kept of war. When rescue finally came, the men of PT-109 were too weak to cheer. They just watched in silence as the boat approached, another PT, its aluminum frame glinting in the sunlight. They had survived the unthinkable, but they did not feel victorious. As one sailor later wrote, "We didn't win, we just lived, and sometimes that's all you can do." For Kennedy, that night would never leave him. He would joke about it years later, but those who saw him then, on that island, said his eyes carried the weight of something unspoken. The war had shown him what leadership really meant. Not orders, not speeches, but staying in the water when everyone else was too tired to swim. And for the engineers who built PT-109, for men like Sutphin and Higgins, the news of its survival proved what no test could measure. That aluminum, wood, and willpower could hold together, even when everything else broke apart. War has a way of testing more than men. It tests materials, ideas, even the faith a nation has in its own imagination. By 1943, the U.S. Navy had begun to believe in something it once mocked, the aluminum boat, not because of boardroom arguments or technical reports, but because of what happened in the dark waters of the Solomon Sea because of PT-109 and the hundreds of others like her that defied steel, logic, and death. That collision with the Amagiri was supposed to prove the critics right. Aluminum can't survive war, but the aftermath told another story. Because the truth was this. PT-109 didn't sink the way a steel boat would have. She broke apart, yes, but she floated. The buoyancy of her hollow aluminum frames, the lightness of her structure, and the way her wood planking had been reinforced by metal kept her from disappearing into the abyss. Those broken halves, scattered across the waves, became life rafts. And in that miracle of partial ruin, in that strange, stubborn float, lay the vindication of every engineer who had fought for the idea that metal could be light and strong. Far from the Solomons, in factories along the Mississippi, and in machine shops outside New Orleans, news of PT-109's ordeal spread fast. When word reached Andrew Jackson Higgins, he reportedly said nothing at first. He simply stood by one of his boat hulls, his hand resting on the curved aluminum frame, and whispered to a foreman, "She didn't sink, did she?" The man shook his head. Higgins smiled, just slightly. Then she did what we built her for. In the months that followed, aluminum's reputation shifted not overnight, but like a tide slowly turning. The Navy's Bureau of Ships began pushing for more light alloy components in fast attack craft and landing craft. The data from PT boat repairs told the story in numbers. Aluminum hull sections, though dented or torn, resisted corrosion better than steel in tropical waters. Boats could be lifted, repaired, and rearmed faster. A damaged aluminum frame could be bent back into shape with hand tools. A steel one needed a dockyard. For the first time, the Navy started to see aluminum not as a substitute, but as an advantage. By the end of 1944, nearly half of all small combat vessels, from patrol craft to minesweepers, incorporated aluminum frames or fittings. The Mosquito fleet had changed naval design forever, and for Kennedy, still thin from starvation, his back injured from the collision, the idea of floating against all odds had become personal. He wrote later, "It wasn't heroism that kept us alive. It was the way that little boat refused to give up. Even broken, she stayed above water. I suppose that's what courage looks like, the refusal to sink." That line, meant for a private letter, would later appear in campaign speeches in a gentler form. He would talk of resilience, of courage in quiet places. But those who had been there knew what he meant. It wasn't politics. It was aluminum, that fragile, gleaming symbol of American ingenuity that refused to die. Meanwhile, in a dim drafting office in New Orleans, engineer Howard Sutphin sat beside a stack of blueprints. He had followed the war through technical reports and personal letters from the field. When news of PT-109's survival reached him, he paused over his work, a new hull design for a post-war patrol craft, and allowed himself a rare moment of pride. He remembered the jeers in Washington, tin toys, beer cans, aluminum folly. He remembered the endless tests, corrosion, compression, heat. He remembered the way Higgins had thrown a wrench across the factory once when the Navy demanded more rivets in the hull, shouting, "We're not building a bridge, we're building something that floats." Now, in the silence of that office, it all seemed worth it. Because out there, thousands of miles away, a young lieutenant had proven what a blueprint never could. That even when steel fails, spirit and science can float. By 1945, the Pacific had turned. The PT boats, once the hunters, became relics of a war that was burning itself out. Many were left to rot in tropical coves, stripped of engines and guns, their aluminum bones glinting in the sun like the skeletons of extinct creatures. But their legacy remained. Every modern fast attack craft, every hydrofoil and littoral combat ship that came after, bore their DNA. They were all descendants of that strange union of wood and aluminum, that experiment born of desperation and defiance. And in the quiet years after the war, when Kennedy returned to public life, the memory of that boat never left him. He kept the coconut shell, the one he had carved his message into, on his desk at the White House. Right beside it sat a small curved fragment of aluminum hull, polished to a dull silver shine. Visitors would sometimes ask what it was. He would just smile and say, "A reminder that not everything fragile breaks." That was the climax of aluminum's wartime story, not the roar of engines or the crash of battle, but a quiet testament to endurance. A boat that shouldn't have floated, a crew that shouldn't have lived, and an idea that shouldn't have worked, all proving. Together, that lightness is not weakness. And in the years to come, that belief, born in the dark waters of the Pacific, would lift ships, planes, and even dreams higher than anyone had thought possible. The war ended not with the roar of engines, but with silence. Across the Pacific, the ocean that had once burned with fire now glittered with wreckage. Ships lay half-submerged, their skeletons jutting through calm waves like gravestones of a mechanical age, and among them, scattered on forgotten shores and shallow reefs, were the remains of the PT boats. Their aluminum ribs caught the sunlight even decades later. Fishermen in the Solomons still tell of them, pale bones of machines that refused to rust, glinting beneath the water like ghosts. The world moved on. Factories that once pounded out hull plates turned to peacetime production. Men who had built engines now built refrigerators, aircraft, and automobiles. But the engineers, those quiet architects of the impossible, carried the memory of the PTs with them. They had seen the line between theory and survival, and it had changed them. In the years after 1945, aluminum, once doubted, once dismissed, became the backbone of post-war innovation. Airplanes grew lighter, ships grew faster. Even the concept of mobility itself shifted. Speed was no longer just a luxury, it was a philosophy. From the ashes of the Pacific, the age of modern engineering was born. Yet behind every new alloy, every design improvement, was a trace of that wartime desperation. The lessons of the PT boats were written not in textbooks, but in the memories of those who built and sailed them. In design archives from Higgins Industries, you can still find sketches annotated with phrases like, "Reduce weight, every ounce matters. Frame must flex, not fail. Light, but loyal to the sea." Those weren't just engineering notes. They were fragments of a belief that lightness could endure, that speed could save lives, that survival could be built into design. For many of the men who served aboard the Mosquito fleet, the end of war didn't bring peace, only the echo of the waves. Some returned home with medals, others with scars invisible to the eye. A few never returned at all, and for the ones who did, the sound of a PT engine would haunt them forever. One veteran wrote years later, "At night, I can still hear it, the twin Packards. That low rising growl before we hit the throttle. It sounded like youth, like danger, like something that would never end. But it did end. And when it did, those sounds, engines, wind, gunfire, gave way to memory." In 1963, when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, a small wreath was laid at his grave by a group of aging sailors. They had once crewed the PT boats. Most of them were gray-haired now, their uniforms long put away. They stood in silence, holding a small plaque that read simply, "From the men who fought the sea with you." Among the wreath's ribbons was a sliver of dull aluminum, a piece salvaged from a PT wreck in the Solomons. They left it there, beside the eternal flame. For them, it wasn't just metal. It was memory, the memory of nights when the horizon was fire, and the only thing between. Life in the deep was a hull made of wood, rivets, and faith. The legacy of those boats didn't end with the war, or even with Kennedy. It lived on quietly in the bowels of destroyers, in the sleek aluminum skins of jet aircraft, in the unspoken creed of every engineer who dared to challenge impossible. Even today, naval architects speak of weight efficiency, of load-bearing alloys, of resilience under pressure. They speak in formulas and specifications. But behind those sterile words lies the same truth that Kennedy's crew discovered that night in 1943. That strength is not just about what resists, but about what yields and survives. By the late 1950s, the Navy decommissioned the last of the PT boats. Many were burned, their aluminum and wood hulls turned to smoke over Pacific beaches. A few were saved by museums, stripped, restored, displayed in silence behind velvet ropes. Visitors walk past them now, reading placards about horsepower, armament, and speed. But if you listen closely, if you let the quiet settle, you can almost hear it again. The low hum of engines warming in the dark, the whisper of waves against aluminum, the sound of men holding their breath before dawn. These were not grand ships. They were fragile, fast, and fleeting. Yet in their fragility, they carried the very essence of war, the tension between destruction and endurance. The Pacific swallowed their battles. Time erased their names. But what they proved, that courage could be built out of doubt, that fragility could float, remains unsinkable. And so the story comes full circle. The engineers who were told aluminum ships would sink gave birth to the fleet that wouldn't. And though the ocean has claimed most of those slender hulls, the spirit that shaped them still drifts upon the waves, invisible, enduring, weightless. The war ended. But the echo of that impossible engineering, that belief that something light could survive the heaviest storm, still hums beneath every keel that cuts the sea today. The sea does not keep time. It forgets dates, but remembers shapes, the curve of a hull, the echo of an engine, the weight of a man's silence. Somewhere in the Pacific, the last fragments of PT boats still rest beneath the coral, their aluminum bones untouched by rust, glinting faintly when the sunlight pierces the water. To most, they are relics obsolete, forgotten. To those who know, they are something else entirely, a testament to when courage and ingenuity met on the edge of survival. War is often remembered by its victories: Midway, Normandy, Berlin. But real history lives in the small things that refuse to sink. A half-submerged boat, a broken propeller that still turned, an engineer's sketch, smudged with oil. A young officer who refused to give up, even when the sea itself seemed to close in. These are not the loud moments of war. They are the quiet ones, the ones that outlast noise. The PT boats were never meant to be monuments. They were temporary weapons, built in haste, to fight in a war that seemed endless. And yet, in their temporary nature, they found something eternal. The proof that even fragile things can carry great burdens. Every rivet, every weld, every aluminum plate bore the fingerprint of a man who worked without sleep, driven by an impossible promise that something light could save lives. If you stand today beside one of those surviving hulls, the few preserved in museums, you can still see the fine hairline ripples in the metal, the marks of waves that once struck like hammers. You can smell the faint trace of oil and salt still embedded in the wood, and if you close your eyes, you might hear it, a mechanic shouting over the din of the engine, the pop of gunfire echoing across black water, a young sailor laughing because for a few seconds the war felt far away. These ghosts are not tragic. They are reminders. Reminders that progress is born not from certainty, but from doubt. That every bold design, every new material, every leap of faith begins with someone being told it won't work, and doing it anyway. The PT boats were small. Their missions rarely made headlines. But their legacy is vast. It lives in every aluminum frame that flies, in every lightweight hull that cuts through the sea, in every engineer who dares to argue against the impossible. And for those who built them and those who sailed them, the story was never about glory. It was about endurance, about making something fragile enough to move fast and strong enough to come home. When the war ended, most of their names were erased from the rosters. But the sea remembers. It remembers the hum of engines at night. It remembers the shadows racing between islands. It remembers the men who vanished beneath the waves and the ones who floated, carried by the same lightness that once defied every rule of engineering. History likes to measure war in tonnage, in range, in armor thickness. But sometimes, history forgets to measure the human spirit, that unseen alloy forged from fear, faith, and stubborn hope. The PT boats were not just machines. They were proof that fragility, when built with purpose, can outlast strength. That sometimes, the lightest things carry the heaviest weight. And somewhere, beneath the quiet surface of the Pacific, the ocean still whispers to the wrecks below. You were told you would sink, but you floated. And because of that, the world learned to rise.